Alright, today we're going to look at the First World War, or more specifically, the United States' neutral role at the beginning of the conflict. Before we take a look at why the United States was neutral at the start of the war, we need to take a brief look at the war itself. The First World War was fought between two opposing sides. On one side, you had the Central Powers consisting of the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Its opposite was known as the Allied Powers, which consisted of Great Britain, the Russian Empire, France, and starting in 1915, Italy. As I said previously, the USA's role at this time was officially neutral, although as we will discover later on, it is clear the United States favored one side over the other. Looking at the map in the top right-hand corner, we can clearly see how the two sides were laid out, as well as those nations that were neutral. While the United States was not the only neutral nation, it was the most powerful. Here we're going to take a brief look at the causes of the war. The initial spark that set off the fighting was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Ferdinand was assassinated by Serbian nationalists who wanted to break from Austria-Hungary to form their own nation in the Balkans. Note that I said this was the spark that started the fighting. However, the main causes of the war had been building up for quite some time, which were imperialism, the building up of militaries, nationalism, and a web of alliances. Imperialism, for instance. Great Britain and France had huge colonial holdings, which allowed them access to resources, which created a lot of tension among the other European powers, especially Germany, who didn't have access to the vast amount of resources the other two did. Advances in military technology and the building up of militaries was also a prominent factor. You had Great Britain building up its navy, despite the fact that it was already the largest in the world, which prompted Germany to do the same. You had advances in military technology such as the development of machine guns, which stimulated military buildups. What happened was you had nations developing new technologies and enlarging their army and navies, creating a lot of tension that sooner or later was going to have to be released. Nationalism also played a prominent role. Nationalism consists of having a strong pride in your culture and country and believing that your nation is better than the rest. And finally, we had a web of entangling alliances caused by nations and their treaties, which called for a collective common defense of all to come to the aid of the one nation which was attacked. For instance, if Germany invaded France, then Great Britain's treaty with France would obligate them to attack Germany. This in turn would draw other players in. The main point you should take away from this is that an attack by one nation was going to draw in the other powers. The political cartoon below lampoons the system of alliances and does an excellent job of showing how all the powers were drawn into the conflict. Now that we have briefly looked at the causes of World War I, why exactly did the United States remain neutral? There was a strong feeling in the country that this was Europe's war, and there was no reason for Americans to get involved in a conflict that was being fought on another continent, in which it had nothing at stake. Americans at the time had a very strong belief in isolationism, the idea that it is best to look after your own nation's affairs and not to try and get involved in the affairs of other nations that didn't directly affect you. This idea was widely popular at the time and went back to George Washington. Knowing it was popular with the people, President Wilson stressed that the USA needed to, in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as action. Again, I want to stress that he was echoing the popular sentiment of the time. People did not want to get involved in a war. It was so popular, in fact, that Americans actively sought to keep Wilson to his word about remaining neutral. The feminists were especially strong in this area, forming the Women's Peace Party in January of 1915, specifically to keep the USA out of World War I, and it was led by such prominent feminist icons as Jane Addams and Carrie Chapman. Alright, so we know the USA was neutral and neutrality was popular, but that doesn't mean there were not problems associated with the United States' neutrality. It was very difficult for the United States not to be drawn into the conflict. For starters, it had very strong economic ties to the Allied powers, with the Allies purchasing $750 million worth of goods in the opening year of the war, a figure that would only rise as time went on. In other words, the USA depended on trade with the Allies. If we contrast that with Germany, they only purchased $350 million worth of American goods in the opening year of the war, a figure which started to decline as time went on. Given the extreme economic ties with the Allied powers, it was very hard for the USA to remain neutral. It was complicated even further by the United States allowing the Allied powers to buy goods using loans from private bankers, when they didn't have the money to pay for purchases, which was quite often. This was initially opposed by President Wilson as violating the spirit of neutrality, but the administration soon changed its mind. They justified this technical violation of neutrality by claiming that if the United States didn't keep up the pre-war level of commerce, it would severely hurt the economy. The second main problem that made it difficult for the USA to remain neutral was the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany. Remember that since the USA was neutral, it was allowed to trade non-military items with both sides during the conflict. However, this soon proved to be a problem as the British attempted to starve Germany into defeat by blockading the North Sea. Blockade made it impossible for supplies to get to the German people, and went so far as even ensnaring American vessels and taking them to British ports. Even though this process violated international law, the Wilson administration barely protested, and justified it by saying that British could pay compensation for these acts after the war was won. It was reactions such as these that made it clear which side the United States had sympathies for, even though it was officially neutral. Making it even more difficult to remain neutral was Germany's response to the Royal Navy's blockade. They responded with their own blockade of the British islands using their new fleet of undersea boats, more commonly known as the submarine or U-boat. Germany then warned neutral nations to stay away from British waters. The sneakiness of U-boat attacks violated maritime law, which dictated that before a U-boat could launch an attack, they were first supposed to surface, make their intentions known, and then fire. But because U-boats were extremely vulnerable on the surface, they wanted to minimize dangers to themselves, so they didn't announce themselves before firing. This was a process called unrestricted submarine warfare. The situation was made even more cumbersome by the fact that the British started arming their merchant vessels, which were the vessels that carried the supplies for the war, and hoisting the flags of neutral nations over them. So in order to further minimize dangers to themselves and their U-boats, the Germans were not even allowing the civilians and passengers of merchant vessels to leave the ships before they were torpedoed, because if they did, they risked being blown up themselves. It was under circumstances such as these that the United States began to feel an even more intense pressure of having its neutrality under attack, when a British passenger ship called the Lusitania, which was also coincidentally carrying munitions for the war effort, was destroyed by an unannounced U-boat attack in 1915. It killed 1,998 people, 128 of whom were Americans. Americans were furious over the sinking of the Lusitania. Former President Teddy Roosevelt even called for a declaration of war against Germany. Wilson refused this, though, and called for the Germans instead to be held to strict accountability for the destruction of the Lusitania, and demanded they cease all attacks on the passenger ships, as well as give monetary settlements to the survivors, an action which Germany agreed to because they didn't want to bring the USA into the war. Wilson's strict accountability only delayed American entry into the war, though, because it didn't really solve any problems. And by insisting that Americans still had the right to travel on ships of belligerent nations, sooner or later, more Americans were going to be killed. By 1916, there were two separate policies surrounding American neutrality. The American military was being built up in preparation for war due to its still continued U-boat attacks from Germany, which were usually followed by a string of apologies. The President did this by signing into law things such as the National Defense Act, which increased the size of the Army and Navy, and established a Reserve Officer Training Corps, as well as gave the President an easier way to federalize the National Guard in case of war. The second policy was President Wilson publicly declaring his desire for the United States to remain neutral, even basing his re-election as a peace candidate, and using the slogan, "He kept us out of war," which of course he had so far. By 1917, during the third year of the war, no side seemed to actually want peace. Instead, they needed a victory in order to justify the enormous cost they had paid in lives and money. Wilson still repeatedly tried to get combatants to the negotiating table for a peaceful surrender, claiming that everybody needed a peace without victory. Germany rejected this notion, however, believing that the United States had never truly been neutral and that they had sympathies for the Allies, which was a far-fetched notion. They further believed that the United States was getting ready to enter the war effort on the side of the Allies. Germany then resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, hoping to achieve victory before the United States could make a difference in the war effort. The USA responded by this resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare by arming its own merchant vessels, which were carrying over supplies. The USA also received the Zimmermann telegram from the British, which they had intercepted on its way from Germany to Mexico. Arthur Zimmermann, who was the German foreign minister, had proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States joined the war effort. If Germany won, they promised Mexico that they would help it recover the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which they had lost to the United States in the mid-19th century. Americans were infuriated over the German proposal. This, combined with Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, increased the chances of Americans joining the war effort by adding an element of fear to the American public if a German victory was. So what finally brought an end to the end of the United States neutrality? The tensions had risen due to Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and in February and March of 1917, they sunk several U.S. merchant vessels. On April 2nd, Wilson asked for Congress for a declaration of war, which was approved. Despite keeping the United States out of the war for 3 years, Wilson came to believe that the only way to shape the peace of the world was to join the war effort. The United States never officially joined the Allies, however, so they could still claim that they didn't entangle themselves with foreign alliances, and instead joined the war effort as an associated power. Next class, we're going to discuss Americans' mobilization for war and subsequent deployment.